Hey guys, tonight we delve deep, and I mean really deep, into the thrilling, pulse-pounding world of ancient Mesopotamian clay tablet bookkeeping. Okay, I see you reaching for the remote, but stick with me. Imagine, if you will, own time before spreadsheets, before database, before even that slightly dodgy abacus your great-aunt kept as a decorative item. Picture yourself standing barefoot on sun-baked earth, the air thick with the smell of river silt and distant herd animals. The twin rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, glimmer like copper bands under a relentless sun. Their water, the lifeblood of everything you know. This is the Fertile Crescent, the cradle of civilization, and tonight, you're not just visiting. You're about to become one of its earliest accountants. Thrilling, I know. You probably won't survive this narrative onslaught of meticulous, ancient administration without drifting off, which, let's be honest, is precisely the point. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Your support, even in a semi-conscious state, is always appreciated. And hey, while you're at it, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always fascinating to see how far these sleepy tales travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel the gritty texture of the soil between your toes, a constant reminder of the land's dual nature, its immense generosity and its terrifying power. This is a place of burgeoning possibility, a vast and expansive alluvial plains flowed down over millennia by those two mighty rivers. To the north and east, the Zagros Mountains rise, their peaks often snow-capped, sending meltwater down to swell the waterways. To the south and west, the land stretches out into the harsher, drier climates of the Syrian and Arabian deserts. But here in this crescent-shaped region, life is taking a dramatic new turn. You're witnessing and indeed participating in what historians call the Neolithic Revolution. That pivotal moment when humanity decided to swap the exhilarating uncertainty of hunting and gathering for the slightly more predictable, back-breaking labor of agriculture. It's a trade-off, really. Less chance of being eaten by a saber-toothed, well, whatever roamed these lands, but a much higher chance of developing a serious crick in your neck from weeding barley. You squint against the glare, your gaze sweeping over fields of nascent green. Wheat and barley shimmer in the heat haze, and a testament to human ingenuity and the sheer stubbornness of your fellow early farmers. These aren't just pretty plants. They represent a fundamental shift in how your society operates. For the first time, there's a surplus. Not always, mind you. Some years the rivers forget their manners and either flood disastrously, washing away months of hard work, or they shrink, leaving the crop to wither under the unforgiving sun. But when things go right, there's more food than can be immediately consumed. And that surplus is a game changer. It means not everyone has to be directly involved in food production. Some can specialize in making pottery, others in weaving textiles, and some, crucially, in figuring out how to manage all this newfound stuff. You trudge towards the collection of mud brick dwellings that constitutes your village, perhaps one of the very first settlements, growing into something more intimate, a town. The air is alive with the sounds of communal life, the bleating of goats, the rhythmic thud of grain being pounded, the murmur of voices discussing the day's tasks. Children, dusty and energetic, dart between the rounded walls of the houses, their laughter echoing. It all seems idyllic, but beneath the surface a new kind of pressure is building, with more people, more resources, and more complex interactions. The old and puzzled ways of relying solely on memory are starting to fray. Think about it. Last season, Uruk the Strong, everyone has very literal names back then, promised 3 of his finest sheep in exchange for a cartload of your exceptionally good barley. Or was it 2 sheep and a rather fetching of slightly lopsided pot made by his wife? And did he deliver one already? Or was that someone else? Your brain, as remarkable an origin as it is, isn't really designed to keep track of dozens of such transactions, especially when some of them involve future promises or shared community obligations, like maintaining the vital irrigation canals that snake across the landscape, feeding the thirsty fields. If a canal gets blocked or a section collapses, whose turn is it to fix it? Who has already contributed their share of labor, and who's conveniently forgotten? It's the ancient equivalent of trying to split a dinner bill with 15 people when everyone's had different appetizers, and someone only drank tap water but really enjoyed the breadsticks. Chaos. Historians still argue whether the primary impetus for the increasing complexity of society, and thus the need for record-keeping, was the managerial requirement for large-scale irrigation projects, which demanded coordinated labor and resource allocation, or if it was driven more by the burgeoning dynamics of trade and the competition for resources between growing settlements. Perhaps it was a bit of both, a feedback loop where managing waters allowed for more food, which allowed for more people in trade, which in turn required even better organization. What's clear is that human memory alone was becoming a bottleneck. And it's not just about preventing arguments or ensuring fairness, vital as those are. It's about planning. How much grain was harvested this year? How much needs to be set aside for seed and for next year's planting? How much can be allocated to support the artisans, the builders, the emerging class of leaders or priests who mediate with the often capricious gods? Without some way of tracking these quantities, your growing society is essentially flying blind, vulnerable to famine if it underestimates its needs, or stagnation if it can't effectively leverage its surplus. You might see elders using pebbles to count, or making notches on a piece of wood or bone. These are early steps, attempts to externalize memory, but pebbles can be lost or mixed up. Notches are good for simple tallies, but they don't tell you what you're counting, or who was involved in the transaction. You can't easily write 3 prime sheep from Uruk the Strong for barley on the 3rd moon after the big flood unless he tries to palm me off with that scrawny one again, using just notches. There's a need for something more robust, more detailed, more permanent. A quirky little language from this era or slightly later as things developed is the profound importance of beer. Yes, beer. Many scholars believe that the desire for a reliable supply of ingredients for brewing beer was a significant driver in the domestication and large-scale cultivation of grains like barley. It wasn't just a tasty beverage. It was a source of calories considered safer to drink than potentially contaminated what played a role in social and religious ceremonies. Imagine the accounts received measures of barley for the temple, issued measures for the festival of the moon goddess, measures for the brewers, remaining. Suddenly, keeping track of that barley becomes pretty important if you don't want to face a very thirsty and possibly very grumpy deity or populace. The sun is beginning to dip lower, casting long shadows from the simple structure around you. The collective hum of the village softens as families gather for their evening meal. The day's work is done, but the silent, invisible work of remembering, of calculating, of trying to hold the community's economic and social fabric together in your mind continues. You feel the weight of it, the sheer effort of trying to keep everything straight. There has to be a better way. The land itself, the very earth you walk on, the sticky, pliable mud deposited by the rivers, holds a clue, a potential solution. It's abundant, it's malleable, and it can, with a little ingenuity, be molded to remember. The canvas for this new form of memory is all around you waiting. The last rays of the sun paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, and a cooler breeze begins to whisper across the plains, or the faint scent of tamarisk and the distant damp smell of the riverbanks. You sit with that lingering feeling, that cognitive itch, the need for a system, a way to hold onto thoughts, agreements, and the vital numbers that are starting to underpin your world. Your gaze drifts downwards to the very ground beneath your feet. It's mostly dried mud, now cracked in places from the day's heat, but you know that with a little water, this ubiquitous substance transforms. This humble earth, this clay, is about to step into a starring role. It's the unsung hero in the story of how your people, and indeed humanity, began to conquer the limitations of memory. It's not glamorous, not like gold or lapis lazuli that will eventually be prized for decoration and trade, but its utility is about to become unparalleled. This isn't just dirt. It's potential waiting for a purpose. You've seen it used for everything, of course. Your dwellings are made from sun-dried mud bricks, remarkably cool in the summer heat, and relatively easy to construct. The pots and jars that hold your water, your grain, your precious beer, are all shaped from this same earth, fired to a stony hardness. Clay is everywhere, an inexhaustible resource provided by the annual floods that enrich the land. It's so common, in fact, that its profound potential as a medium for information might not be immediately obvious. It's like trying to explain the internet to someone who's only ever used a carrier pigeon. The sheer scale of possibility is hard to grasp initially. But think about its properties. When wet clay is wonderfully plastic, you can shape it, mold it, flatten it. It yields to pressure, takes impressions with beautiful clarity. You've seen children playing with it by the riverbanks, pressing shells or their own small fingers into lumps of wet mud, and you've noticed how faithfully the clay records every tiny detail before it dries. Then, once it dries in the sun, it becomes quite hard, holding its shape. If it's baked in a fire, as with pottery, it becomes almost rock-like, capable of lasting for an astonishingly long time. This right here is a mainstream historical fact. Clay would serve as the primary writing material in Mesopotamia for nearly 3 millennia, a testament to its suitability and abundance. Thousands of years. Imagine your current phone lasting that long. You'd be lucky if the charger still worked after 3 years, let alone the device itself becoming a treasured historical artifact. So, how does the leap happen? How do you go from idly noticing a footprint in the mud to intentionally using it to record that Uruk the Strong still owes you a sheep? Archaeologists and historians debate the precise timeline and sequence of when clay transitioned from merely a building or pottery material, to an intentional medium for symbolic representation beyond simple decorative motifs. It probably wasn't a single eureka moment. More likely, it was a gradual dawning, a series of small innovations. Perhaps someone idly scratched a mark on a soft clay jar stopper to indicate its contents or owner. Maybe a builder counting out bricks made little dabs in a lump of clay to keep track and noticed later that the marks were still there, a permanent little reminder. You might experiment. You take a handful of that damp, cool earth from near the irrigation ditch. It feels smooth, slightly gritty and yielding in your palm. You flatten it out on a rock, creating a smooth and even slab. What if instead of trying to remember the 5 goats you've promised to the temple, you just make 5 simple marks on this? You press your fingertip into the surface. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's surprisingly satisfying. The clay faithfully records the impression. You leave it in the sun. Later you come back and it's hard. The 5 little depressions clearly visible. It's a start. It's not sophisticated. It doesn't say goats or temple, but it's a tangible external memory aid. It's better than just relying on your own increasingly cluttered mind. Consider the alternatives available to your ancient self. What else could you use? Stone is durable, certainly. You've seen carvings on rocks, perhaps territorial markers, or depictions of great hunts. But carving stone is laborious. It requires specialized tools and a lot of effort. It's fine for a monumental inscription, but hardly practical for recording everyday transactions or quick tallies. Imagine trying to chisel "I owe you 1 goat" every time someone made a promise. You'd develop carpal tunnel before lunchtime. And stone tablets aren't exactly portable if you're dealing with a lot of information. What about wood or bark? These are lighter, easier to inscribe perhaps. But in the Mesopotamian climate, with its periods of dampness and its hungry insects, wood doesn't last. It rots. It gets eaten. Any records you made would turn to dust relatively quickly. Papyrus, that wonderful smooth material made from reeds, which the Egyptians would later use to make great effect, isn't readily available here. The papyrus plant prefers the Nile's banks, not the Tigris or Euphrates in the same in abundance, and the complex process of manufacturing it into a writing surface is yet to be widely developed or imported. Even if it were the specific way of writing that will emerge here, pressing wedge-shaped marks into a surface is perfectly suited to clay, but less so to the fibrous nature of papyrus. Clay has that unique quality of taking a 3-dimensional impression, which will become key. It's almost comical how perfectly suited clay is. It's cheap, it's everywhere. It's easy to work with using the simplest of tools, even just a pointed stick or your own fingers. And it offers a spectrum of permanence. If a rehacut is temporary, like a quick calculation or a rough draft, you can just smooth the wet clay over and reuse it. Or if it's already dried, you can pulverize it, add waters, and voila, a fresh slate. This is a rather neat, quirky tidbit for less important documents, or for students practicing their writing. Mesopotamians often just sun-dried the tablets. These could then be soaked in water, kneaded and reformed, making clay a surprisingly recyclable medium. Talk about sustainable ancient tech. However, if you wanted that record to last, to be official, to survive disputes, or the ravages of time, you could bake the clay tablet in a kiln, making it as durable as pottery. Many of the tablets we have today survived precisely because they were baked either intentionally or accidentally when cities were burned during conflicts. A rather destructive form of archival backup. You can imagine early experiments. Perhaps someone tries to draw a picture of a goat next to their 5 marks. It's a bit crude, a bit wobbly, but it adds another layer of information. The medium is forgiving of these early fumbling attempts. It doesn't judge your artistic skill or your penmanship, or, well, your stylishship as it will soon become. The very act of working with the clay, of feeling its responsiveness, must have been encouraging. It's like the difference between typing on a sleek modern keyboard and, say, trying to input data using 2 coconuts and a very patient parrot. One is clearly more conducive to getting things done. The sun has completely set now and the stars are beginning to emerge incredibly bright in the unpolluted sky. The idea of using this mud, this earth, to give thoughts a physical form, to make words and numbers tangible, is taking root in your mind. It's not just about accounting, though that's a powerful initial driver. It's about communication across time and space. A message inscribed in dried clay can be carried to another village, another town. A record made today can be consulted weeks, months, even years later. The implications are staggering, though perhaps not fully grasped all at once. For now, the simple practical advantages are enough. Clay is the answer to the growing pains of your society. It's the medium that will allow for order, for complexity, for the very foundations of what we call civilization to be meticulously recorded, one sticky earthy impression at a time. The night deepens around your small settlement, the air growing cooler. You've embraced the potential of clay, that wonderfully responsive medium. You've seen how it can capture a simple mark, a pressed fingertip, a scratched line. But how do you move from these rudimentary tallies to something that can truly represent the burgeoning complexity of your economic life? How do you make clay speak, not just count in ambiguous dimples? The answer, it turns out, lies not just in making marks on clay, but in making marks with clay, or at least with tiny, specially shaped pieces of it. You're about to witness the birth of a system, an ingenious method of accounting that predates what we'd fully call writing, yet forms its direct ancestor, the token system. Imagine your hands still perhaps a little damp from experimenting with that river mud. Now picture yourself reaching into a small pouch or a designated pot. Inside, you feel a collection of curious little clay objects. Some are simple spheres like tiny marbles. Others are cones. Some are small discs, some are rods, and some are more complex, perhaps little tetrahedral shapes or ovoids. These aren't children's toys, though they might seem like it. Each distinct shape, and sometimes its size, represents a specific commodity or a specific quantity. For instance, a small clay cone might stand for a measure of barley, a sphere for a larger measure, perhaps a cylinder or a stylized animal head for one of your livestock, a sheep, a goat, maybe even an ox. This is a mainstream historical fact. This token system is meticulously pieced together by archaeologist Denise Schmont-Besrat, was a sophisticated accounting tool used across the Near East for thousands of years before the invention of writing proper. It was in essence a system of three-dimensional symbols. You're a temple administrator, let's say. or a village headman responsible for the communal storehouse. Someone brings in 3 measures of barley. You don't just nod and try to remember. You reach for your tusses. You pick out 3 of the barley measure cones. Someone else contributes a sheep for an upcoming festival. You select the token that means 1 sheep. At the end of the day or the week, you can literally count your assets by counting your tokens. It's tangible. You can pick them up, arrange them, see at a glance what you have. It's a definite step up from trying to keep it all in your head, and certainly more specific than random notches on a stick. It's like ancient inventory management, but with more charm and a distinct lack of barcodes. If you dropped your pouch of tokens, though, that would be the ancient equivalent of a hard drive crash, a rather literal misplacing of your assets. But this system, clever as it is, has its own emerging challenges. What happens when you need to send a consignment of goods, say 10 jars of oil and 5 goats, from your village to another for trade? You gather the corresponding tokens. 10 oil jar tokens, 5 goat tokens. You hand them over to the person transporting the goods, who will then exchange the tokens for the actual items at the other end. Or perhaps the tokens travel with the goods as a sort of bill of lading. But how do you ensure no tokens go missing accidentally or otherwise? How does the recipient trust that the number of tokens they receive is the number you'd sent? Disputes could easily arise. You only sent tokens for 8 jars of oil. No, I distinctly remember putting 10 in the bag. This is where the next ingenious step comes in, the bulla. You take a lump of fresh clay, the same kind you've been using for your practice slabs. You fashion it into a hollow ball, like a small clay coconut, perhaps the size of your fist or a bit smaller. Then you take the tokens for a specific transaction. Those had 10 oil jar tokens and 5 goat tokens. And you pop them inside this hollow clay ball. Then you seal it up. Now the tokens are secure, a little clay rattle full of ancient data. When it reaches its destination, the recipient has to break the bulla to get the tokens out and verify the shipment. Tamper-proof, right? Breaking the seal would be obvious. It's like an ancient security envelope, or perhaps an early form of mystery box. What transactional data will I find today? The unboxing videos, Mesopotamian style, probably involved less screaming and more careful cracking. This is clever, but it introduces a new, slightly comical inconvenience. To check what's supposed to be in the shipment, you have to destroy the container that verifies its integrity. What if you just want to quickly confirm the contents without smashing the bulla? What if there's a discrepancy after it's broken? The evidence of the intact seal is gone. And so, driven by this practical need, comes the crucial evolutionary leap. Before sealing the tokens inside the bulla, you start to press the tokens themselves onto the soft, wet clay of the bulla's outer surface. So, if you have 10 oil jar tokens and 5 goat tokens inside the ball, you press those same shapes. 10 oil jar shapes, 5 goat shapes, onto the outside of the ball before it dries. Now you have a sealed container with the actual tokens inside and an external list of what those internal tokens represent. Anyone can look at the outside of the bulla and see what's meant to be accounted for. This is a huge step. The abstract representation of the goods is now directly linked to the sealed physical tokens. You can probably see where this is going. You look at one of these bullae, with its external impressions clearly showing, say, 3 cones and 2 discs. You know this means 3 measures of barley, and 2 sheep are accounted for within. After a while, a thought might strike you or someone particularly observant in your community. If the marks on the outside accurately represent the tokens on the inside, why do we still need the tokens on the inside? If the impressions themselves can carry the information, the tokens within the bulla become redundant. The clay shell of its originally just a container is now becoming the message itself. Slowly the practice shifts. Instead of forming a hollow bulla, you might just take a lump of clay, flatten it, and press the tokens into it to make the required impressions. Or realizing that you don't even need the actual tokens anymore if you can just incise or impress shapes like them, you start using a stylus or a shaped piece of reed to mimic the token shapes. The spherical bulla, once its internal contents are deemed unnecessary, naturally flattens out under the pressure of these impressions or is intentionally formed into a more convenient cushion-shaped or rectangular slab. These are the very first true clay tablets. They bear the ghost images of the tokens that were their ancestors. A circular impression once made by pressing a spherical ton might now represent the number 10. A small wedge shape made by pressing a conical token might mean 1, or a unit of grain. Scholars continue to discuss the exact meaning of every single token shape, and whether the system was universally understood across different Mesopotamian communities or if regional dialects of token usage existed. It's fascinating to think that these little clay objects had such specific meanings. Indeed, a rather quirky tidbit is that some of the more complex tokens weren't just plain shapes. They had incised lines or patterns on them. This suggests they could convey more nuanced information. Perhaps not just sheep, but ewe, or ram, or not just wool, but high-quality wool versus standard wool. The level of detail they were aiming for, even at this early stage, is quite remarkable. It's like they were trying to create a super-specific emoji for every type of farm produce. So, you are now at the threshold. The clay is ready. The idea of using symbol is established through these tangible tokens. And the token shapes themselves are providing the initial vocabulary for these symbols. You're moving from a 3-dimensional accounting system to a 2-dimensional one. The clay tablet, that iconic artifact of Mesopotamia, is taking its first clumsy, beautiful steps into existence, all because people needed a reliable way to remember who owed what and how much. The stage is set for these simple impressed marks to evolve into a full-fledged writing system. So, you're standing at this fascinating juncture. The idea of using clay to record information has solidified. Those little tokens and their impressions on the outer shells of bulla have given way to the concept of directly marking a prepared piece of clay. The tablet in its most nascent form rests in your conceptual toolkit. But simply having a surface isn't enough. How do you make marks that are consistent, clear, and capable of evolving into a sophisticated system? You need the right tools, and you need to master the craft of hitting them. This is where the humble river reed steps into the spotlight, transformed by a human ingenuity into a powerful instrument of record-keeping. Forget fancy fountain pens or sleek styluses for your digital devices. You're about to get intimately acquainted with the ancient equivalent and the rather messy hands-on process of creating your very own software and hardware. First, let's talk about the tablet itself. It's not just any old clod of mud you pick up. Oh no, there's an art to preparing your writing surface. You'd likely head to a known clay pit near the river, where the sediment is fine and smooth. You look for clay that's not too sandy, not too gritty. Once you've gathered a sufficient quantity, and remember, clay is heavy stuff, so this is already a bit of a workout. The real preparation begins. You have to clean it. This involves a process called levication, where you mix the clay with what shall allow the heavier impurities like pebbles and bits of organic matter to settle, and then pour off the finer clay slurry. You will let this slurry dry to the right consistency, a bit like a potter preparing their clay. It's a mucky, time-consuming job. Definitely a case of getting your hands dirty, literally. No wonder the guides eventually achieved a certain status. The prep work alone was a commitment. Once your clay is clean, you need to knead it thoroughly, like a baker working dough. This is called wedging, and it's crucial for removing any air bubbles. An air bubble in a tablet could cause it to crack or even explode if it were later fired in a kiln. Plus, kneading ensures a uniform, smooth consistency, which is essential for making clear impressions. You'd work the clay, folding it, pressing it, feeling its texture change until it's perfectly plastic and responsive. Only then would you begin to form it into a tablet. Early tablets, as we've hinted, were often somewhat pillow-shaped, a gentle echo of their bulla ancestors. But quite quickly they became more regular, typically rectangular. You might pat the clay into shape with your hands, or perhaps use a flat piece of wood to create more defined edges and a smoother surface. The size could vary enormously. Some were small, fitting neatly in the palm of your hand, perfect for a quick receipt, a short list, or a student's practice exercise. Others were much larger, like ancient ledger pages intended for more extensive records, inventories of temple goods, legal cas, or perhaps even the very early attempts at literature. You can't ascribe carefully passing the size and shape based on the task at hand, much like you'd choose between a sticky note and a full sheet of paper today. Now for the pen, the stylus. The mainstream historical fact here is that the primary writing tool for cuneiform script was a stylus, most commonly fashioned from a reed. The word cuneiform itself, from Latin cuneus meaning wedge, and forma meaning shape, refers to the distinctive wedge-shaped marks that make up the script, and this shape is a direct result of the tool used. You'd venture down to the riverbank where reeds grow in dense thickets. You select a straight, mature reed, not too thick, not too thin. Then, with a sharp flint or obsidian blade, you'd carefully cut a section. The magic happens in how you shape the tip. One end of the reed would be cut to create a sharp, angular profile, often triangular or like a tiny, dull knife edge. This wasn't for drawing lines in the way we think of writing with a pen or pencil. Instead, you would press this shaped tip into the moist clay. The angle at which you held the stylus and the pressure you applied would determine the shape and size of the wedge. A direct, firm press might create a triangular head. A press and a slight drag could elongate it. By combining these basic wedge shapes in different orientations and groupings, you could form an incredible variety of scenes. There is ongoing discussion among Assyriologists about the precise evolution of stylus shapes, and how variations in the stylus tip-ups might indicate different scribal schools, period, or even individual scribal preference. It's like handwriting analysis, but for indentation, made thousands of years ago. Early stylus prototypes probably weren't very ergonomic. You can imagine a lot of trial and error, snapped reed tips and misshapen wedges before a comfortable and effective design was settled upon. The other end of the stylus might be left rounded or cut but flat, useful for making circular or semicircular impressions, often used for numbers or for smoothing over mistakes if the clay was still wet enough. So, you have your perfectly prepared damp clay tablet, cool and yielding, in one hand. In the other, you hold your freshly cut reed stylus. You take a breath. You're about to make your mark, quite literally. You angle the stylus and press the tip into the clay. It gives way with a soft, satisfying squish, leaving a neat little wedge. You lift and press again, perhaps slightly differently. To create another part of a scene, it requires precision. Too little pressure and the mark is faint. Too much and you might go right through a smaller tablet or distort the shape. You're not dragging the stylus to write. You're impressing. This is a fundamental. It's more like typing in a very, very analog way than it is like cursive handwriting. For more complex records, you might even prepare your tablet with guidelines. Scribes would sometimes lightly score the damp clay with a straight edge, or the stylus itself, creating rows or columns to keep their signs neatly organized. This is the ancient equivalent of lined paper, ensuring that your list of sheep doesn't accidentally merge with your list of barley rations, which would cause no end of administrative headaches. Imagine the temple accountant trying to explain why the sheep now appear to be measured in bushel. A rather useful, quirky tidbit for aspiring ancient scribes. You'd likely have a small bowl of water nearby, especially if you were working on a larger tablet, or if the day was particularly hot and dry. If the clay started to dry out too quickly, making impressions difficult or causing the surface to crack, you could dip your fingers in the water and gently re-moisten the area. This water was also handy for correcting errors. If you made a wrong impression and the clay was still sufficiently damp, you could often use the flat end of your stylus or your finger to gently smooth over the mistake and try again. Of course, if it dried too much, well, there was no easy undo button in an ancient Sumer. Your mistake was there for, if not eternity at least, until someone decided to recycle the tablet by soaking it. The physical act of writing, of pressing these symbols into the clay, must have been a very focused, almost meditative practice. The slight resistance of the clay, the careful angling of the stylus, the gradual appearance of meaningful patterns under your hand. It was a craft honed through years of practice. You can picture young students in a scribal school, their tongues perhaps sticking out in concentration as they try to master the hundreds of signs, their early efforts probably looking more like a chicken walked across the clay than any recognizable script. But with time and dedication, the movements would become fluid, the impressions precise, and the ability to capture complex information on a humble slab of mud would become second to none in their world. This combination of prepared clay and shaped reed was the technological breakthrough that truly unlocked the power of written records. You're now equipped. You have your carefully prepared clay tablet, cool and damp, waiting patiently in one hand. In your other, you cradle your reed stylus. its type. Expertly cut to press sharp, clear wedges into the clay. The workshop around you, perhaps a quiet corner of a temple complex, or a bustling administrative office near the city gate, hums with the hollow murmur of commerce and record-keeping. But the crucial question remains, what exactly are you going to impress into this receptive surface? How do these deliberate little wedges and shapes actually mean something, especially something as complex as "and owes me 3 sheep to be delivered by the next full moon, and one of them better not be that scrawny one from last time"? The journey from simple impressed token hams to a versatile script, capable of sealing deals and managing an entire economy, is a fascinating one, driven by the relentless engine of human transaction. Initially, as we saw, the marks were often direct imitations or impressions of the tokens themselves. A circle for a large unit, a cone for a smaller one. The next logical step as you try to convey more specific information is to attempt to draw the object you're talking about. So, if you're recording a delivery of oxen, you might try to sketch a simplified picture of an ox's head. If it's barley, perhaps a stylized stalk of grain. These are pictographs, signs that visually resemble the thing they represent. You can't imagine yourself, stylus in hand, carefully trying to ennow the outline of an ox head. It's a bit slow. Perhaps your artistic skills aren't quite up to par. Your ox head might end up looking more like a confused potato with horns, but the intent is there. The sign is iconic. It bears a direct visual relationship to its meaning. This pictographic stage is intuitive, but it has its limitations, especially when the demands of your burgeoning temple or palace economy start to get serious. Drawing pictures is time-consuming. And how do you draw receive or paid or in the future or good quality? How do you represent a person's name if it's not something easily picturable like bird or mountain? Commerce, by its very nature, needs efficiency and clarity. You can't have your scribe spending all day creating a miniature art masterpieces for every single transaction. The deals won't get sealed, the accounts won't get balanced, and the whole system will grind to a halt, probably with a lot of frustrated grumbling about slow data entry. So pressure mounts to simplify, to stylize. That carefully drawn ox head over time and countless repetitions starts to lose its overtly pictorial quality. Your stylus, with its wedge-shaped tip, is much better at making quick short presses than it is at drawing smooth curving lines. Gradually the curves are straightened, the details are dropped. The ox head becomes a series of strategically placed bays that are much faster to produce. It's no longer a drawing of an ox head, but an abstracted symbol for an ox head, and by extension for an ox. This process of conventionalization is vital. Everyone needs to agree that this particular cluster of wedges means ox, even if it doesn't look much like one anymore to the untrained eye. A crucial development in this process, and a mainstream historical fact, was the rotation of science. Early pictographs were often oriented in the way you'd naturally see them or draw them. A fish sign might be upright head pointing upwards. However, as scribes began to write more quickly, or perhaps as the size and orientation of tablets changed, maybe larger tablets were rested on the lap or a stand, making a different angle more comfortable for writing. Some signs were turned on their side, typically 90 degrees counterclockwise. Suddenly, your upright fish is now swimming horizontally across the tablet. This rotation further distanced the signs from their original pictorial appearances, pushing them more firmly into the realm of abstract symbols. It must have been a bit confusing at first. Is that a fish? Or has a tree fallen over Urnansha? But it streamlined the act of writing considerably. As these signs become more abstract and efficient to write, another incredibly powerful innovation begins to take hold: the rebus principle. This is where a sign, which originally stood for a particular object or idea, a logogram, starts to be used to represent the sound of the word for that object, even in completely unrelated contexts. It's like using a picture of a bee and a picture of a leaf to represent the word belief. Or, in a more Sumerian context, the sign for mouth, pronounced agketai, could also be used to write the sound ka-is in a longer, more complex word that had nothing to do with mouths. Similarly, the Sumerian word for arrow was t. So, the sign representing an arrow could also be used to represent the syllable tato whenever it appeared, or even to write the abstract word life, which was also pronounced tai. This was an absolute game changer. It was the ancient equivalent of a dad joke, unlocking the secrets of literacy. Suddenly, you could write down things that had no obvious pictorial representation. Personal names, grammatical particles, abstract verbs, and concepts. The script was no longer tied to just tangible objects. This combination, simplified wedge-based signs born from the stylus's action on clay, the rotation that standardized their orientation, and the clever application of the rebus principle, is what gives rise to true cuneiform. It becomes a wonderfully flexible if complex system. Some signs remain logograms standing for whole words, as like our insane. Others become syllabograms representing syllables like ba-baby-bo-boo. And a third category emerges: determinatives. These are unpronounced signs placed before or after a word to indicate its general category. For example, a certain wedge pattern placed before a name would tell you it's the name of a gut, another might indicate a wooden object, and another a city. This helped to reduce ambiguity, as some signs could have multiple meanings or phonetic values. Think of it as an ancient form of metadata, embedded right into the text. Throughout this entire evolution, from the first fumbling pictographs to sophisticated syllabic cuneiform, the driving force is often the mundane, practical need to record economic information. The earliest clay tablets we have are overwhelmingly administrative in nature. They are lists of goods receipts for deliveries, tallies of livestock, records of land sales, payrolls for temple workers. These signs seal deals quite literally. A tablet might record: barley received from the farmer Alulu, 2 fat sheep issued to the kitchen of the high priestess, contract for the sale of a field witnessed by 3 named individuals. It's not exactly thrilling poetry, but it's the bedrock of organized society. A quirky tidbit is that some of the earliest known authors, whose names or identities can be loosely associated with specific documents, weren't bards or philosophers, but the individuals drawing up these vital economic and legal tablets. Their creations ensured that goods moved, labor was compensated, and obligations were met. Scholars still debate the precise speed of this evolution from pictograph to fully developed cuneiform, and whether the rebus principle was a sudden brilliant innovation by one unknown genius, or a more gradual realization that occurred in different places, somewhat independently as the need arose. Regardless of the exact timeline, by around 2500 BCE, the system was well established, capable of recording not just lists of sheep and barley, but also laws, letters, religious hymns, and eventually epic literature. But it all started with the need to keep track to ensure fairness in trade and to manage the growing wealth of these first cities. Your stylus, pressing those wedge-shaped meanings into the clay, is doing more than just accounting. It's laying the very foundation for history itself. All right, so there you are, stylus poised, clay tablet patiently waiting. You've started to master the art of forming those clever little wedge-shaped signs that can represent an ox, a measure of barley, or even the concept of delivery. Your ability to record what is being transacted is growing by the day. But the heart of bookkeeping, the core of any economic record, isn't just about the what. It's about the how much, how many oxen, how much barley. How do you represent these quantities efficiently and perform calculations with them? This is where you delve into the rather unique and surprisingly sophisticated world of Mesopotamian mathematics. Specifically, their sexagesimal or basmati counting system. Now don't let the fancy term sexagesimal send you scrambling for the snooze button. It's a fascinating system, and once you get the hang of it, you'll see its peculiar genius, especially for a society deeply involved in trade, agriculture, and dividing things up. We humans mostly tend to think in base 10. We have 10 fingers, 10 toes, usually, so it feels natural. Our entire numerical system revolves around powers of 10. But the ancient Mesopotamians, those trailblazers of civilization, marched to the beat of a different drummer, or rather counted to the tune of a different bass. They used a sexagesimal system. This is a mainstream historical fact. Their mathematics, particularly for calculations and metrology, was fundamentally built around the number 60. Why 60? Why not something simpler like 10 or even 20? Were they just trying to make future history students scratch their heads in confusion? Probably not. The exact routes for the adoption of a sexagesimal system are still a subject of considerable scholarly debate, with theories ranging from its elegant mathematical properties, namely its high divisibility, to a possible fusion of earlier different counting systems used by various cultures that merged in Mesopotamia. Imagine trying to explain base 60 to someone today. So you count up to 59, and then the next number is kind of like one and nothing extra of the next 60 block. It sounds a bit bonkers at first, but think about the number 60. It's a wonderfully accommodating number. It can be evenly divided by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This makes dealing with fractions a dream compared to base 10. Want to divide something into thirds in base 10. You get that annoying 0.33 recurring. In basic, 1/3 of SAO is a clean 20. 1/4 is 10. 1/5 is 12. 1/6 is 10. For a society that needed to divide rations, calculate shares of harvests, measure out plots of land, or compute interest on loans, having a base that handles common fractions so neatly was a massive advantage. Now, how did you actually write these numbers down? On your clay tablet using your trusty reed stylus. They didn't have 60 different unique symbols for numbers 1 through 59, thankfully. That would have been a bit much, even for the most dedicated scribe. Instead, they had a more elegant system, primarily using just two basic cuneiform signs for numerals. For the number 1, you'd press the tip of your stylus vertically or slightly slanted to create a thin nail-like wedge. For the number 10, you'd press the corner of your stylus down to create a more triangular or arrowhead-like wedge, often oriented horizontally or angled. So, to write numbers from 1 to 9, you'd simply repeat the one wedge the required number of times. 3 one wedges meant 3. 7 one wedges meant 7. Easy enough if a little repetitive for higher single digits. To write numbers from 11 to 59, you'd combine the 10 wedges and the 1 wedges. For example, the number 23 would be 2 10 wedges followed by 3 1 wedges. The number 47 would be 4 10 wedges and 7 1 wedges. You can see how this builds up. It's a cumulative system within each block of 60. But what about 60 itself, or numbers larger than 60? This is where the concept of positional notation comes in, similar to our own system, where the 1 in 100 means something different from the 1 in 10. In cuneiform, a 1 sign could mean 1, or it could mean it, or the 3600, which is 60 and 60 depending on its position relative to other numbers or the context. So, if you saw a 1 wedge, then a space, then say the wedges for 15. That could mean 1 unit of 60 plus 15 units of 1. So, it could even represent fractions. The same 1 followed by 5 could, in a different context, mean 1 1/8, which is 1 1/4. This positional aspect was incredibly powerful, allowing for the representation of very large numbers and complex fractional quantities. However, one of the initial headaches, and a source of much scholarly amusement and frustration, was the early lack of a symbol for 0 or a consistent placeholder. Imagine seeing 2 1 wedge next to each other. Does that mean 2 1 plus 1, or does it mean 1 1 60 plus 1? Or even 3601 through 600 plus 60. One context was often key. Later on, scribes did begin to use a gap or a special placeholder sign, often 2 small slanted wedges, to indicate an empty internal position, making things a bit clearer. The ancient equivalent of mind the gap. So your 60 doesn't accidentally become a 1. One rather though speculative, quirky tidbit about the possible origin of base 60 involves counting on your hands. No, not just your 10 fingers. Try this on one hand. Use your thumb to count the knuckles on your other 4 fingers. Each finger has 3 salmon or knuckles. Don't count the one where it joins the palm for this. So 4 fingers and 3 knuckles each. That gives you 12. Now every time you count to 12 on one hand, you raise 1 finger on your other hand. Since you have 5 fingers on that other hand, you can keep track of 5 sets of toe. And what's 5 times toe exactly set? It's a neat theory, suggesting that the sophisticated mathematical base might have sprung from a very practical body-based counting method. Whether it's true or not, it's a fun way to think about how they might have conceptualized these numbers. So, back at your accounting tablet, you're listing out quantities of grain received from farmer Enlil Bani 2, meaning 2 sites to 60, 120 plus 35 core measures of barley. You'd write the cuneiform sign for 2, then perhaps leave a slight space, or follow a columnar convention and then write the signs for 35. Your colleagues would understand this as 55 core measures. You might be calculating the area of a field length times width, with both measured in units and fractions of units, easily handled by base 60, or figuring out the interest owed on a loan of silver. Don't try this complex base 60 math in your head before your first cup of coffee, by the way. Your brain might just stage a protest, but for the Mesopotamian scribe trained from a young age in this system, it was second nature. This sexagesimal system is one of Mesopotamia's most enduring legacies, echoed today in our 60-minute hours, 60-second minutes, and the 360 degrees in a circle. Every time you check your watch, you're giving a tiny nod to those ancient accountants and their 60-based sums. You're now fully equipped, a true pioneer in the nascent field of information technology, Mesopotamian style. You have your carefully sourced and prepared clay, your versatile reed stylus, a grasp of the evolving cuneiform script that can turn pictures into abstract symbols, and a counting system based on the robust number 60. The theoretical framework is in place. Now it's time to get down to business, to the very nitty-gritty of what filled these ancient data storage devices. What were these first digital records? And yes, I use it digital, loosely referring to the discrete countable units of information they held. Actually, at Trimsking, you'll find the concerns and were surprisingly down-to-earth, focused on the essentials of life, labor, and of course, a good brew. Imagine yourself in the bustling administrative heart of an early Sumerian city, perhaps Uruk, one of the world's first true urban centers. The air is thick with the sounds of human activity, the smell of cooking fires, livestock, and the ever-present dusty tang of sun-baked brick and earth. You, as a budding scribe or temple functionary, are tasked with keeping tabs on the city-state's wealth. And at what constituted wealth back then primarily, it was agricultural surplus. So, the absolute star of these early ledgers, the item appearing again and again, is barley. Barley was the foundational crop, the calorie king. Your tablets would meticulously record the incoming harvests from surrounding fields, listing quantities in gur or other standard measures, often next to the name of the cultivator or the district that supplied it. Then you'd track the outgoings, bartloin for rations, distributed to temple workers, to canal diggers, to weavers. Barley set aside as seed for the next planting season. Barley allocated as feed for the temple, so palace's livestock. Every transaction, every movement of this vital resource had to be noted. It's no exaggeration to say that the entire Mesopotamian economy was built on these golden grains. And what was one of the most important things barley was used for besides basic sustenance? Beer. Yes, that delightful fermented beverage we still enjoy today was a cornerstone of Mesopotamian life. Clearly, beer was a strategic resource, possibly requiring its own government department, or at least its own section on your clay tablets. You'd find records detailing the amounts of barley and emmer wheat, another common grain allocated to the brewers. There might be entries tracking the production quotas for different types of beer, because yes, they had different varieties, from everyday brews for workers to finer quality stuff for temple rituals or the elite. Distribution lists would show who received beer rations and in what quantities. It was a form of payment, a social lubricant, and a ritual offering. The mainstream historical fact is that the vast majority of the very earliest cuneiform tablets unearthed in them, particularly from the Uruk IV and III periods around 3200–3000 BCE, are precisely these kinds of administrative and economic texts. They aren't epic poems or philosophical treatises. They are careful, often dry accounts of commodities like grain and, yes, beer. The third pillar of these early accounting efforts was labor. Building and maintaining a city, its temples, its palaces, and especially its vital irrigation canals, required a massive coordinated workforce. How did you keep track of who worked what they did, and how much they were owed in rations, often barley and beer, naturally? You guessed it, clay tablets. You might see lists of worker names or gang designations, the number of days they worked, the type of task though they performed. Digging the main canal, carrying bricks for the temple of Inanna, weaving textiles for export. It was essentially ancient project management and human resources. Imagine clocking in for your shift, not with a punch card, but by having your overseer make a little mark next to your name or work group symbol on a damp clay tablet. Sorry, Lugal Shah, you're not in the clay. You don't get your barley rotation today. Beyond these big three of barley, beer, and labor, your tablets would be filled with inventories and transactions for a host of other essential goods. Livestock was crucial, sheep and goats for wool, milk, and meat, cattle for traction and dairy, donkeys for transport. You'd track herd sizes, births, deaths, and animals exchanged or sacrificed. The tablets would note how many sheep were plucked for their wool, and how much wool was allocated to the weavers. Textiles themselves, primarily wool and linen, were a major industry and an important trade good. Your records would detail production targets and the distribution of finished cloth. Land management was another key area. Tablets would record the dimensions of fields, their estimated yields, ownership or lease agreements, and the allocation of irrigated plots. Metals, though scarcer and more valuable, also appeared. It's copper and later bronze for tools and weapons. Silver, often in coils or rings, used as a standard of value for exchange, essentially an early form of money. And gold for luxury items and temple adornment. This would be meticulously whistled and their movements recorded. Even everyday items like sesame oil used for food lighting and anointing and various types of wooden or reed objects would find their way onto your inventory lists. Historians and linguists continue to decipher and debate the precise meaning of certain rare commodity signs or units of measure found on very early administrative tablets, as their exact real-world equivalents are not always clear from context alone. It's like trying to figure out an obscure ingredient in an ancient recipe based only on a tiny, stylized drawing. Looking at one of these tablets now, you see rows and columns of these neat little wedge-shaped imprints. Each mark is a discrete piece of information, a data point. A particular cluster of wedges means barley. Another set of wedges and circles means 25 units. A name, like Urnamu, is spelled out syllabically. This is why one might cheekily call them the first digital records. The information is broken down into fundamental, distinct units. It's not a flowing impressionistic painting. It's a structured database, albeit one made of mud. The original spreadsheet program, and now with 100% more clay. You can almost feel the satisfying heft of a large ledger tablet, knowing it contains the vital statistics of your community's economic health. A fascinating, quirky tidbit is that among the thousands of administrative tablets discovered, some record incredibly mundane day-to-day transactions. you might find a tablet that is essentially a daily ration list for a small group of named temple workers detailing the exact, often quite modest amount of bread and beer each individual received. These are like ancient pay stubs or daily expense logs. There's one famous example, though, from a slightly later period, that is interpreted by some as a customer complaint about the quality of copper ore delivered. It shows the very human everyday concerns that these records addressed. It wasn't all grand temple inventories. Sometimes it was just about making sure everyone got their lunch or that a business deal was fair. These tablets bring you incredibly close to the daily rhythms and preoccupations of life thousands of years ago. You've seen the system, the carefully prepared clay, the versatile stylus, the intricate dance of cuneiform signs representing everything from barley to abstract concepts, and the surprisingly sophisticated sexagesimal numbers used to count it all. You've even glimpsed the contents of these ancient records, the meticulous tracking of grain, beer, livestock, and labor that form the backbone of Mesopotamian society. But who was actually doing all this complex work? It certainly wasn't a skill picked up in an afternoon. The sheer complexity of mastering hundreds of cuneiform signs, learning the nuances of the base atomic system, and understanding the proper formats for various types of administrative documents meant that a new kind of professional had to emerge, the scribe. You are about to meet the indispensable, often unsung heroes of Mesopotamian bureaucracy, the ancient IT support, database managers, and executive assistants, all rolled into one. Literacy, as we understand it today, was far from universal in ancient Mesopotamia. The cuneiform script, with its vast array of signs, some logographic representing a whole word or idea, some syllabic representing a sound, and some acting as determinatives, clarifying the category of a word, was a formidable challenge. It wasn't like learning a simple alphabet of oscillators. Mastering cuneiform along with the associated mathematics required years of dedicated study and practice. Think of it as learning multiple complex coding languages simultaneously, but with the added pressure that your work is being etched onto a semi-permanent medium. With a skill set like that, you'd probably never be out of a job. Got cuneiform literacy and advanced sexagesimal math will travel for beer rations. This intensive educational requirement naturally led to the rise of a specialist class. These weren't just people who could write. They were people whose entire profession was writing and record-keeping. In Sumerian, they were known as dubsir, which literally means tablet writer. These individuals, overwhelmingly male, though a few notable female literates and even scribes are known, often came from families with some means, families who could afford the significant investment in a child's long education, which could start in early childhood and continue well into young adulthood. This is a mainstream historical scribal training was an arduous and lengthy process, effectively restricting widespread literacy to a small elite percentage of the population. The status of a scribe in Mesopotamian society was considerable. They were highly respected, viewed as possessors of vital and somewhat arcane knowledge. They were the original knowledge workers, the white-collar professionals of the ancient world. The Sumerians had proverbs that reflected this esteem, such as, "The scribal art is the mother of orators, the father of masters," or another that translates rightly to, "A scribe whose hand moves as fast as his mutation, that's a scribe for you," or even a scribe as a friend for you. They were seen as essential for the smooth functioning of virtually every significant institution. Temples, with their vast agricultural holdings and complex ritual requirements, needed scribes to manage inventories, track offerings, and administer estates. Royal palaces depended on scribes for everything from issuing decrees and managing state finance to conducting diplomatic correspondence and recording royal achievements. Large agricultural estates and burgeoning commercial enterprises also relied on scribes to keep accounts, draft contracts, and manage logistics. Of course, it wasn't all power and glory. Someone still had to count the goats, again, and then record the counting of the goats. Historians debate the precise level of social mobility afforded by scribal training. Was it primarily a path for talented individuals from more modest backgrounds to rise through the ranks of society? Or was it predominantly a way for existing elite families to consolidate and extend their influence by ensuring their members controlled the levers of bureaucratic power? The truth probably lies somewhere in between, with opportunities existing, but perhaps favoring those already in a privileged position. Imagine yourself now as one of these dubsar. Your toolkit is relatively simple but essential. You have your bag, perhaps made of leather or woven reeds. Inside, you carry your styluses. You might have a few of different sizes or with slightly different tip profiles. Perhaps one you've cut and shaped yourself to fit your hand perfectly. You'd have a supply of well-prepared moist clay, maybe wrapped in a damp cloth to keep it workable, or you'd have access to a source of it at your place of work. Perhaps a small pot of water for moistening the clay, or cleaning your fingers, and maybe a straight-edged piece of wood or bone for smoothing surfaces or ruling lines. With these humble tools, you wield considerable influence. While our focus is on bookkeeping, it's important to remember that scribal duties often extended far beyond just tallying barley and beer. A skilled scribe might be called upon to write letters dictated by an illiterate merchant or official. They would draft legal documents, marriage contracts, adoption papers, land sale agreements, loan documents, ensuring the wording was precise and legally binding. They recorded court decisions, copied learned texts, religious hymns, myths, medical treatises, mathematical problems, astronomical observations, and helped compile king lists and historical annals. The ability to read and write was a gateway to many roles. However, for many scribes, especially in the bustling economic centers, the daily grind would indeed involve those meticulous administrative and accounting tasks that kept the wheels of the economy turning. As a scribe, you are a gatekeeper of information. When a transaction occurs, when a legal agreement is made, when rations are distributed, it is your hand that commits the official record to clay. Your interpretation of spoken words, your choice of signs, your calculations, these become the enduring reality of the event. This placed a heavy responsibility on you. Accuracy was paramount. Imagine the terror of misspelling an important deity's name in a temple inventory, or perhaps more immediately perilous, getting the king's barley figures wrong in the royal accounts. There was no easy backspace key on a rapidly drying clay tablet, and mistakes could have serious consequences not just for the records, but potentially for the scribe himself. A rather interesting, quirky tidbit is the occasional presence of colophons on tablets. more common on literary or scholarly texts than on everyday administrative dockets. A colophon was a note added by the scribe at the end of the work. It might include the scribe's name, tablet of or Nana Junior Scribe, the date, the title, or first line of the work. If it was a known text, sometimes the name of the senior scribe or teacher under whom they worked, and occasionally even a little blessing for the tablet, or a curse against anyone who might steal it or damage it. It's a little touch of individuality, a signature asserting authorship or responsible copying, a practice that hints at the pride scribes took in their exacting craft. Even on more mundane administrative tablets, as distinct hands or styles of writing and can sometimes be discerned in suggesting individual scribes at work within the bureaucracy. The rise of the scribe then was a direct consequence of the increasing complexity of Mesopotamian society and its innovative record-keeping technology. They were the human interface between the events of the world and the enduring memory of the clay. The skilled professionals who transformed spoken words and counted goods into the indelible language of cuneiform. Without them, the vast economic and administrative machines of the temples and palaces would have quickly sputtered and failed. So, you've seen the Dubsar, the Mesopotamian scribe in action, a figure of respect, a linchpin of the bureaucracy wielding their stylus, like a maestro with a baton, orchestrating the flow of information on cool, damp clay. But how did one ascend to such an esteemed position? It wasn't a matter of simply picking up a reed and having a go. Oh no. The path to becoming a scribe was long, arduous, and filled with what can only be described as the tablet house trials. You're about to step into the noisy, disciplined, and probably rather dusty world of the Aduba, the Sumerian term for the scribal school, literally meaning tablet house. This is where young minds were molded and often thrashed into the literate professionals who kept the Mesopotamian world running. Imagine yourself as a young boy, perhaps around 6 or 8 years old. Your family has decided that you will pursue the prestigious career of a scribe. This means you're off to the Aduba. These schools could be attached to temples or palaces, or they might be run as private enterprises by a headmaster known as the Umiya expert, or school principal, sometimes referred to as the school father. You'll leave your home early in the morning, perhaps, with a lunch of bread and dates packed by your mother, and head towards a modest mud brick building, buzzing with the sound of young voices and the rhythmic tapping of styluses. Forget learning your office. You're about to embark on a journey to master hundreds, eventually thousands of complex cuneiform wedge combinations before you even think about recess. If recess was even a thing. Your first lessons are deceptively simple yet foundational. You learn how to properly prepare a small practice tablet, kneading the clay to the right consistency, shaping it into a manageable often palm-sized and sometimes lens-shaped, known as a kishibra or hand tablet. You learn how to hold the stylus, how to press it into the clay to make the basics wedge shapes. The vertical, the horizontal, the diagonal, and the corner wedge, or winkelhaken. You will practice these in individual wedges over and over and over again until your hand aches and the shapes are uniform. Your early tablets would be covered in rows of these elemental strokes, like a musician endlessly practicing scales. Once you have some control over the stylus, you move on to learning the signs themselves. This isn't a haphazard process. A mainstream historical fact is that scribal education revolved around the extensive copying and memorization of lexical lists. These were meticulously organized lists of cuneiform signs and words, often arranged by category: lists of gods, lists of places, lists of trees and wooden objects, lists of animals, lists of professions, lists of body parts, lists of stones, and so on. You would copy these lists repeatedly, gradually building up your repertoire of signs and their meanings. It's like learning a vast visual dictionary entry by painstaking entry. Some of these lists were standardized and copied for centuries, forming a core curriculum across Mesopotamia. Then there's the challenge of language. By the Old Babylonian period, roughly 1900 to 1600 BCE, which is when many of our texts describing Aduba life come from, Sumerian was largely a dead language in terms of everyday spoken vernacular. Akkadian, a Semitic language, was the common tongue. However, Sumerian remained the prestigious language of religious literature, law and scholarship, much like Latin in medieval Europe. So, as an aspiring scribe, you had to become bilingual. You'd learn Sumerian grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation, or at least what was believed to be the correct pronunciation. You'd copy Sumerian texts, translate them, and perhaps even compose simple sentences in Sumerian. This was a significant intellectual hurdle. Imagine being a modern student forced to conduct all your advanced studies and write your most important papers in, say, Chaucerian English, but with significantly more goats and barley involved in the subject matter. And of course there was mathematics. Your bookkeeping career depends on it. You'd dive deep into the sexagesimal system, learning addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. You'd work with multiplication tables. Yes, they had those on clay, tables of reciprocals, essential for division in base, square root, and even more complex calculations. You'd learn practical geometry for measuring field areas, crucial for an agricultural syllabus, and as calculating volume is for things like grain storage or canal construction. You'd tackle word problems. If a canal of spout and such length, width, and depth needs to be dug, and one worker can move so much earth in a day, how many worker days are needed? The mathematical training was rigorous and directly applicable to the administrative tasks you'd eventually undertake. Daily life in the Aduba was not for the faint of heart. The day started early and ended late. Discipline was notoriously strict. Many Sumerian texts, often called Aduba literature, or school days texts, paint a vivid picture. There are references to the Shita whip and the man in charge of the whip, or the man in charge of Sumerian. Laziness, making mistakes in your copying, chattering in class, sloppy handwriting, being late, or even getting up without permission, could all earn you a caning. It was the original no pain, no gain educational philosophy with a very literal emphasis on the pain. One text, humorously, or perhaps with a wince of memory, recounts a student's litany of daily fears: fear of being late, fear of the master's displeasure, fear of a poor performance. Besides the Ummiyah, there were other figures in the school hierarchy. The Ada Aduba, literally father of the tablet house, another term for a teacher or master, and the Shekgal, big brother, who was often an older student or an assistant teacher, helped with instruction and discipline. You'd spend your day hunched over your clay tablet, diligently copying texts, reciting lists aloud, trying to get your wedges just right. Lunch, usually brought from home, was likely a welcome if brief respite. Scholars debate the extent to which Aduba education aimed at fostering creative thinking versus promoting rote memorization and strict conformity, and how much variation might have existed between different schools or individual masters. While much of the learning involved meticulous copying, the goal was not just to produce human photocopiers. The advanced stages of education involved understanding complex literary texts, composing letters, and solving intricate mathematical problems, suggesting a development of critical thinking skills was also valued, at least for the top student. A particularly charming and humanizing quirky tidbit from these school days texts is a story where a student having a particularly bad time and facing multiple beatings for various infractions persuades his father to invite the Umiya home for dinner. The father lavishes the teacher with good food, fine oil, new clothes, and a gift of money. Lo and behold, the teacher's attitude towards the student miraculously improves the next day, praising his work and predicting a great future for him. It's a timeless tale of seeking favor, and perhaps the earliest documented instance of apple polishing, the teacher Mesopotamian style. So, as you sit there in the dim, dusty light of the Aduba, your fingers sore, your back aching, the stern voice of the Umiya echoing in your ears, you are part of a tradition that will shape civilizations. These tablet house trials, as grueling as they are forging you into someone who can read, write, calculate, and most importantly, for your future career, manage the increasingly complex records of a world taking its first giant leaps into organized society. The path is hard, but the rewards, a respected profession, a role at the heart of power and administration, are significant. You've made it. The grueling years in the Aduba are behind you. Your hand is steady. Your knowledge of sines and sexagesimal math is secure, and you can probably run a lexical lists in your sleep. You are now a dubsar, a scribe ready to apply your hard-won skills in the real world. So, what kind of tasks await you? What diverse ledgers of life will you be meticulously inscribing on your clay tablets? You'll find that your skills are in demand across a surprisingly broad spectrum of Mesopotamian society, from the grandest institutions to the private dealings of individuals. Your stylus is about to become a key that unlocks the daily operations of a civilization. Your first major assignment might be within the sprawling temple complex. The temples were not just places of worship. They were enormous economic engines, often the largest landowners and employers in the city-sect. Imagine yourself in a bustling temple archive, surrounded by stacks of tablets. You'd think they'd have invented filing cabinets sooner, or at least a really good shelving system with clear labels. Here, you'd be responsible for managing the temple's vast agricultural holdings. This means tracking the barley, wheat, dates, and sesame harvested from temple lands, noting the yields from different fields, and recording the share owed by tenant farmers. You'd meticulously list the temple's herds of cattle, sheep, and goats, documenting births, deaths, and the allocation of animals for sacrifices, or for providing wool and dairy. Offerings and sacrifices pour into the temple daily: grain, beer, oil, livestock, precious metal, textiles, and every single item must be accounted for. The gods apparently had very specific catering requirements all itemized, of course. You'll also be managing the distribution of rations, barley oil, wool, beer to the legions of temple personnel, priests, priestesses, administrators, weavers, brewers, smiths, potters, farmers, and laborers who kept the entire enterprise functioning. The temple workshops, producing everything from fine textiles for divine statues to everyday pottery, would also fall under your administrative hus, tracking raw materials in and finished goods out. These temple archives were in many ways the big data centers of antiquity, holding a comprehensive economic snapshot of a significant portion of the city's wealth. Alternatively, or perhaps as a promotion, you might find yourself working in the palace administration, serving the king and the royal household. Here the scale of operations is equally impressive, if slightly different in focus. You'd be dealing with royal finances, which means tracking taxes collected from the populace, tribute, flowing in from conquered territories or vassal states, and income generated from the king's personal estates. If the king decides to embark on a major building project, a new palace and wing, a magnificent ziggurat, or reinforcing the city galt, the scribe will be there logging the allocation of precious timber, countless mud bricks, and the wages and rations for the laborers. Military logistics would also be a key concern. Keeping an army supplied requires meticulous planning and record-keeping: how many weapons, how many chariots, how many pack animals, how much grain and dried fish for the soldiers on campaign. All this would be carefully tabulated on clay. You might even find yourself drafting or copying royal decrees and edicts, or taking down the details of diplomatic correspondence, though that leans more into statecraft than bookkeeping. Still, the lines often blurred for a versatile scribe. But it wasn't all grand institutional accounting. Your skills as a scribe would be equally valuable in the realm of commercial and private business. Mesopotamian society, especially by the Old Babylonian period or during the heyday of the Old Assyrian trade colonies, had a vibrant merchant class. A mainstream historical fact is that these merchants conducted extensive long-distance trade networks for instance, between Mesopotamia and Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, for textiles and tin, in exchange for silver and gold, or with regions like Dilmun, possibly Bahrain, for copper. These ventures, often partnerships or family businesses, were meticulously documented. You'd be drawing up tablets recording goods, entrusted to a traveling agent, detailing the quantities and expected returns. Upon the agent's return, you'd calculate profits, divide shares among partners, and record any outstanding debts. These merchant archives, like the thousands of tablets found at Kultepe, ancient Kanesh in Turkey, provide an incredibly detailed look at sophisticated credit-based trade. On a more local level, you'd be busy with everyday private transactions. Someone needs to borrow a quantity of barley or silver until the next harvest. You'll draft the loan document specifying the amount, the often very high interest rate, sometimes 20 to 50%, the repayment terms, and crucially listing the names of witnesses to the agreement. This is the ancient IOU, legally binding and preserved on durable clay. That awkward moment when your friend formalizes your 2-shekel debt on a clay tablet, complete with witnesses and a repayment schedule tied to the next full moon. You'd also draft sales contracts for a house, a field, an orchard, or even for the sale of slaves. These tablets would describe the property, its dimensions or boundaries, the agreed-upon price in silver, barley, or other commodities, and again the names of the seller, buyer, and witnesses. Rental agreements for fields or houses, marriage contracts, detailing dowries and the property rights of the spouses, and inheritance documents dividing estates among heirs. All these crucial life events and economic exchanges were committed to clay under your skilled hand. While some of these lean more towards legal documents, they almost invariably involve the transfer or accounting of property, and thus have a strong bookkeeping component. Scholars actively debate the extent of private versus institutional, temple, palace economic activity in different periods of Mesopotamian history, and how accurately the surviving tablet archives, which often come from official institutions because they were better preserved or intentionally archived, reflect the true balance of the overall economy. It's possible that a vast amount of smaller-scale private enterprise went unrecorded, or that its records simply haven't survived as well. Beyond these more formal categories, there's the miscellaneous pile of tablets that offer glimpses into even more personal aspects of life. You might be asked to record a simple list of household possessions, perhaps for an inheritance division, or a small tablet might serve as a receipt for a minor transaction. A particularly interesting quirky tidbit is the existence of what appear to be clay tags, or labels. These small, often roughly formed pieces of clay bearing a few signs or impressions might have been attached to sacks of ground, jars of oil, or bales of wool, functioning like ancient inventory tags, or even rudimentary price labels indicating contents, ownership, or destination. Imagine a tiny clay sticky notes. Across all these diverse records, you'd see certain common features: the meticulous listing of quantities, the names of responsible parties, the careful dating of the transactions, often by a regnal year of the king or by a significant event like the year the Great Canal was dug. Standard formulas would emerge for common types of documents, ensuring clarity and legal standing. Your work as a scribe, whether in the grand temple, the bustling palace, the merchant's office, or for a private citizen, was about bringing order and permanence to the ephemeral flow of goods, services, and obligations that made up Mesopotamian life. Having graduated from the demanding Iduba and taken your place in the world of Mesopotamian administration, you're now adept at creating a wide array of documents. You've tracked barley for the temple-managed ration lists for palace workers, and perhaps even drafted a merchant's inventory for a risky but potentially lucrative expedition up the Euphrates. But your role and the significance of the clay tablets you so carefully inscribe extends far beyond mere accounting or list-making. Many of these documents, the loan agreements, the sales contracts, and the marriage settlements, the land leases, carry immense legal weight. You're not just a record keeper. You're often an architect of binding commitments. Now you'll witness how these humble slabs of inscribed clay become the star witnesses, the irrefutable proof when agreements sour and disputes arise. Clay isn't just for counting. Clay is contract. Imagine a scenario: two individuals, let's call them Ur-Ningirsu and Lu-Utu, made an agreement a few years ago. Ur-Ningirsu loaned Lu-Utu a significant amount of silver, enough to purchase a new ox for his plowing. You, or another scribe like you, meticulously recorded the terms on a clay tablet, the amount of silver, the agreed-upon interest rate, which, as you know, could be quite steep, the names of Ur-Ningirsu and Lu'utu, the date, and crucially the names of several upstanding citizens who witnessed the transaction. Now the time for repayment has come and gone, and Lu'utu is claiming he never borrowed that much, or that the interest was lower, or perhaps even that he already paid it back. An argument ensues. How is this resolved in ancient Mesopotamia? This is where your handiwork, the clay tablet, takes center stage. In any formal dispute before a local assembly of elders, temple officials acting as judges or royal judges, the written record was paramount. While oral testimony would be heard, the inscribed tablet was considered far more reliable than the fallible and potentially self-serving memories of the litigants. The phrase "let the tablet speak" might well have been a common sentiment. The sheer durability of clay, especially if baked, though even sun-dried tablets could last for centuries in the dry Mesopotamian climate, if undisturbed, meant that the record of the agreement could easily outlive the original witnesses or even the parties themselves. What made these tablets so legally potent in several key elements, which you as a scribe would have been trained to include. First, the clarity of the terms. You would have used standardized formulas and precise language to detail the names of all parties involved, the exact nature of the transaction, e.g., loan of silver, sale of a field, the specific quantities of goods or silver, the due dates for repayment or fulfillment of obligations, and any other pertinent conditions. Ambiguity was the enemy of a good contract then as now. Second, and absolutely vital, were the witnesses. Most, if not all, significant contractual tablets would bear a list of individuals who were physically present when the agreement was made and the tablet inscribed. These weren't just casual bystanders. They were often respected members of the community, whose testimony could be called upon if needed. Having your name on a dozen loan tablets as a witness must have been the ancient equivalent of being everyone's favorite, most reliable emergency contact, or perhaps just someone who couldn't say no. Third, though we'll delve deeper into this marvel in the next section, was the use of seals. Parties to the agreement, and often the witnesses too, would roll their personal cylinder seals across the wet clay of the tablet, leaving their unique impressed insignia. This acted as a form of signature, a mark of personal validation of the tablet's contents, and a powerful deterrent against later attempts to deny involvement or tamper with the record. Your name as the scribe might also be noted, adding another layer of attestation to the document's authenticity. A mainstream historical fact is that Mesopotamian law codes, the most famous being the Code of Hammurabi from the 18th century BCE, but reflecting older legal traditions, often explicitly stipulated the need for written witnessed contracts for important transactions like marriage, the sale of land, or slaves, or commercial partnerships. These law codes themselves, often inscribed on monumental stone stelaes or large clay tablets for public display, reinforced the societal importance of documented agreements. So, to Ur-Ningirsu and Lu'utu, they bring their dispute, and Ur-Ningirsu brings his tablet to the judge. The tablet is presented. The judges examine it. They note the clear terms: 10 shekels of silver, an interest rate of 1/3 a common rate for silver loans, the names, the date. They see the list of witnesses. Perhaps one or two of those witnesses are even present in the assembly, and can confirm they were there, and saw Lu'utu agree to the terms. Lu'utu's protests about a lower amount or a different rate begin to look very weak against the silent, steadfast testimony of the clay. Once it's baked or even thoroughly sun-dried, there's no sneakily editing the terms and conditions. Talk about a hard copy. Legal historians continue to debate the degree to which judicial decisions were strictly bound by prior written contracts versus allowing for equitable considerations or extensive oral testimony, especially in cases where tablets might be ambiguous, damaged, or genuinely contested as fraudulent. However, the general principle was that a clear, properly witnessed and sealed tablet was very strong evidence. You can picture the scenes. Forget Law and Order Euphrates Valley. It was more like tablet and testimony Sumerian settlements. An heir presenting a tablet detailing their rightful inheritance against a greedy relative, a merchant showing a receipt for goods delivered to a client, now denying the purchase, a farmer whose field boundary is contested producing the original sales tablet with the precise measurements of his plot, as surveyed and recorded by a scribe years ago. The power of the written word fixed in clay was immense. It provided a dose of a certainty of predictability in economic and social interactions that would have been impossible if reliant solely on memory or verbal promise. It created a framework of accountability. A fascinating, quirky tidbit that underscores the importance and perceived integrity of these documents is the practice of creating tablets, or envelope tablets. For particularly important contracts, the scribe would write out the agreement on a tablet. Then, before that inner tablet dried, it would be enclosed in an outer layer of clay forming an envelope. The terms of the contract, or at least a summary, would often be copied onto the surface of this clay envelope. If a dispute arose, the envelope could be examined. If its seal was intact, and the outer text matched what was expected, all was well. If there was serious contention about the terms, the judges could order the envelope to be carefully broken, revealing the pristine, protected inner tablet, which would be considered the definitive version, safe from any tampering that might have occurred on the exposed outer surface. This was an ingenious, if somewhat bulky, method of ensuring documentary security. The psychological impact of committing an agreement to clay must also have been significant. Knowing that your words, your promises, your obligations were being physically impressed into a medium that could last for thousands of years, likely gave a certain gravitas to the proceedings. It wasn't just a handshake deal. It was a pact set in stone, or rather set in clay, witnessed, sealed, and ready to speak for itself should the need arise. Your word as a scribe, therefore, was not just about recording the past, but about shaping the future legal and economic landscape, one binding tablet at a time. All right. You've established that the humble clay tablet, once inscribed by your skilled hand, can become a powerful legal instrument capable of settling disputes and upholding agreements. It's clear that these documents were the bedrock of economic and legal stability. But with such power comes great responsibility and great temptation. If a clay tablet can prove a debt-defying ownership of land or to seal a marriage contract, how did your ancient Mesopotamian counterparts ensure these records were accurate, authentic, and safe from the prying fingers of fraudsters, or the simple erosion of time? You're about to uncover the ingenious methods they developed for guarding the glyphs, ensuring that what was written in clay remained true. The first and perhaps most iconic line of defense was the cylinder seal. This wasn't just a simple stamp. It was a marvel of miniature artistry and personal identification. Imagine holding a small cylinder, usually an inch or two long, crafted from hard stone like hematite, lapis lazuli, obsidian, carnelian, or even simple shell or fired clay for less affluent individuals. Intricately carved into its curved surface would be a unique reverse-cut design. These weren't just random patterns. They were often dynamic scenes featuring gods, heroes, mythological creatures, animals worshiper, or symbols associated with the owner, sometimes have even including the owner's name and profession inscribed in a tiny cuneiform. Your signature was literally a work of art. Bet your current bank manager would be impressed, if a little confused, if you tried to sign a check by rolling an ancient rock across it. When a contract was drawn up or an important administrative document finalized, the scribe would ensure that the parties involved, and often the witnesses too, rolled their personal honor seals across a designated area of the still moist clay tablet. As the cylinder turned, it left a continuous, repeating band of the design impressed into the clay. This served multiple purposes. Firstly, it was authentication. The unique impression acted like a legally binding signature, irrefutably linking an individual to the document. A mainstream historical fact is that cylinder seals were a primary method of authenticating documents in Mesopotamia for over 3,000 years. Secondly, it was a powerful anti-fraud device. Forging someone's intricate seal design perfectly would be incredibly difficult. Furthermore, if someone tried to alter the tablet after it had been sealed, say by smoothing over a number and trying to rewrite it, they would have to break the existing seal impression. Reapplying the seal without the original owner's cooperation would be impossible, and any attempt to patch or mimic the impression would likely be obvious. Losing your cylinder seal was probably the ancient equivalent of a major identity theft crisis. Cue the frantic search party, and a public announcement that your seal was no longer valid. Building on the security of the seal, and as we touched upon briefly before, was the clever invention of the case tablet or envelope tablet. This was like giving your most important documents their own built-in tamper-evident packaging. You would first inscribe the contract or record on a primary tablet. Then, while this inner tablet was still damp, or perhaps after it had partially dried, you'd wrap it in another layer of clay, completely encasing it. This outer layer formed an envelope. Often the text of the inner contract, or at least a summary of its key terms, would be copied onto the surface of this outer envelope. Then, crucially, the cylinder seals of the parties and witnesses would be rolled across the surface of this outer case. The genius of this system lay in its layered security. For everyday reference, people could read the text on the envelope. If a dispute arose, or if there was any suspicion of tampering, the sealed envelope provided the first checkpoint. Were the seals intact? Did they belong to the named parties? If everything looked in order, but the dispute persisted above the precise wording, then, under proper authority, perhaps in a court setting, the clay envelope could be carefully broken open. Inside it, pristine and protected, would be the original inner tablet. It was considered the definitive version, untouched since its initial inscription and encasement. Debate exists among scholars regarding how consistently the breaking of case tablets was performed under official supervision, or if private individuals could break them, potentially leading to disputes over the act of unsealing itself. But the principle was clear: 2 layers sealed independently made unauthorized alterations significantly harder. Of course, technology alone isn't always enough. The human element remained vital. The presence of witnesses whose names were meticulously recorded on the tablet, and who often affixed their own seals, provided another layer of security. These individuals could be called upon to verify that they were indeed present at the transaction, and that the tablet accurately reflected the agreement they witnessed. Their collective testimony and the integrity of their seals bolstered the tablet's authority. Your own scribal practices also contributed to accuracy and fraud prevention. The careful, methodical way you were trained to write using standardized legal formulas and terminology for common transactions helped to minimize ambiguity that could later be exploited. On more elaborate tablets, especially literary or scholarly ones, but sometimes even on important administrative documents, you might add a colophon. This could include your name and, as the scribe, the date, the source you copied from if applicable, and occasionally even a formulaic curse against anyone who might damage, steal, or illicitly alter the tablet. A sort of ancient digital rights management, but with more supernatural enforcement. Making a typo on a tablet before it was baked was annoying. Making one after it was baked was a permanent monument to your blunder, unless you wanted to start the whole tablet over. The creation of multiple copies of important agreements was another straightforward security measure. Each party involved might receive a copy, or a master copy might be deposited in a temple or palace archive for safekeeping. Speaking of archiving, this was crucial for the longer-term integrity of records. Important tablets, particularly those intended for permanent record, would often be baked in a kiln, making them as hard as pottery and virtually indestructible by water or insects. These baked tablets, along with important unbaked ones, were stored in designated archive rooms. Archaeologists have found these rooms with tablets still neatly arranged on shelves in reed baskets, or even in large clay jars, and sometimes with small clay tags or labels indicating the contents or category of tablets within. A rather interesting, quirky tidbit is that some cylinder seals incorporated what are known as apotropaic images, designs or figures believed to have the power to ward off evil, bad luck, or malevolent spirits. So, when an individual rolled their seal onto a contract, they might not only have been signing it in a legal sense, but also imbuing the agreement with a kind of magical protection, ensuring its terms were upheld, and that no misfortune befell the transaction. It added a whole other layer of "don't mess with this document" to the proceedings. Ultimately, the very medium of baked clay offered a fundamental security feature: it was difficult to alter invisibly. Unlike papyrus, which could potentially be scraped and rewritten though with difficulty, or wax tablets, which were designed for erasure, a baked cuneiform tablet was a fixed record. Any attempt to add or remove wedges after baking would involve chipping or scratching the surface, leaving glaring evidence of tampering. This inherent immutability made clay a remarkably trustworthy guardian of the glyphs, ensuring that the agreement, accounts, and pronouncements of ancient Mesopotamia could endure secure and verifiable for millennia. You've journeyed through the intricacies of cuneiform, mastered the curious logic of base 60 mathematics, witnessed the solemnity of clay contracts, and even peeked into the high-stakes world of ancient data security with cylinder seals and case tablets. By now it's becoming abundantly clear that this isn't just a quaint historical curiosity. What you're seeing is a system, as a technology of information management that became utterly fundamental to the way Mesopotamian civilization functioned. Records weren't just an occasional convenience. They were the invisible scaffolding supporting every major pillar of society. Records quite simply ruled all. You probably couldn't even trade a slightly used chariot or a prize-winning goat without a clay tablet changing hands, possibly in triplicate, witnessed, sealed, and filed away for future reference. Let's revisit the temple, that grand institution at the heart of every Mesopotamian city. As a scribe working within its hallowed, or at least very busy, precincts, you are an essential cog in a massive economic machine. The temple might own vast tracts of fertile land along the rivers. Your tablets track every stage of cultivation and the allocation of seed and plows, the labor deployed for irrigation and harvesting, and crucially, the enormous quantities of barley, wheat, dates, and sesame oil that flow into temple granaries and storehouses. These aren't just rough estimates. These are meticulous accounts. You'd record yields per field, track supplies to the temple's bakers and brewers. Remember, the gods and the temple staff needed their daily bread and beer, and manage distributions to the hundreds, if not the thousands of personnel. From the highest priests and priestesses down to the weavers, potters, smiths, and agricultural laborers who depended on the temple for their sustenance. The temple's livestock, enormous herds of sheep and goats for wool and sacrificial offerings, cattle for plowing, and dairy, would be subject to constant inventory. Your stylus would fly across the clay, noting births, deaths, trades, and the amount of wool plucked or milk collected. Temple workshops producing fine textiles, sacred ornaments, or everyday pottery, all their inputs of raw materials and outputs of finished goods, would be meticulously recorded. A mainstream historical fact is that the economies of these major Mesopotamian institutions were highly administered, relying on a complex hierarchical system of scribal record-keeping for virtually all aspects of resource allocation, labor management, and detailed accounting. It was big business, divinely sanctioned. Then shift your gaze to the palace, the seat of royal power. Here, too, your scribal skills are indispensable. The king needs to know the wealth of the realm to govern effectively. Your tablets would document the inflow of taxes, typically paid in kind, grain, livestock, silver, from the various provinces and cities under his control. Tribute from vassal states, a clear indicator of the king's dominion, would be carefully listed. When the king decided to build a new palace, extend the city walls, or dredge a major canal, it was you, the scribe, who managed the monumental logistics, tracking the thousands of laborers. The vast quantities of bricks, timber, often imported, and therefore precious, and other materials, in the distribution of rations to keep the workforce fed and presumably relatively content. The royal army, the king's strong right arm, also ran in on records. You'd be keeping tabs on supplies of weapons, armor, chariots, and the all-important rations for soldiers, whether stationed in garrisons or out on campaign. Even diplomatic exchanges involved record-keeping. Lists of gifts sent to neighborous rulers or received from them, all carefully noted, maintain prestige and track obligations. Royal edicts and legal pronouncements distributed throughout the land originated on clay tablets drafted in the palace scriptorium. Imagine the royal auditors themselves, probably senior scribes, showing up at a provincial governor's office. Right, Lugal Mardu. Let's see your barley receipt tablets and tax remittance records for the last fiscal year. All of them. The scribes were in essence running the operating system for the entire kingdom. No wonder they often got paid in decent quality beer and prime rations. And what of the bustling world of commerce? Mesopotamian merchants, as we've seen, were intrepid figures undertaking long and often perilous journeys to trade goods like textiles, tin, copper, silver, and grain. None of this would have been possible on a large scale without meticulous record-keeping. As a scribe working for a merchant house, you'd be at the heart of this activity. You'd draft partnership agreements where multiple investors pooled resources for a trading venture. You'd list the exact quantities and types of goods entrusted to a traveling agent, along with detailed instructions. Upon their return date, you'd be the one to calculate expenses, tally profits or losses, and divide the shares among the partners according to the initial agreement, all recorded on clay. Letters carried by trusted messengers across vast distances would update partners on market conditions, report sales, and request further instructions or goods, these letters themselves being carefully archived. The old Assyrian merchant colonies in Anatolia, like Kanish, provide a stunning example of this, with thousands of tablets revealing a highly sophisticated credit-based commercial network that functioned entirely through written correspondence and detailed accounts on clay. Historians and archaeologists continue to analyze the vast archives to understand the relative economic power and autonomy of the temple versus the palace in different cities and periods, as the lines of control and resource management were often intertwined and are not always clearly delineated in the records. It's a complex puzzle, with each tablet providing a small but valuable piece of evidence, even in what we might term private life, at least for those with property or engaging in significant personal economic activities. The culture of record-keeping permeated. You, as a freelance scribe, perhaps might be called upon to draft a marriage contract, carefully listing the dowry brought by the bride, and the bride price paid by the groom's family, establishing the financial foundations of the new household. Inheritance documents detailing the division of a deceased person's property among their heirs according to law or their stated wishes were crucial for preventing family feuds. Adoptions, which often had economic implications regarding inheritance and support, were formalized on clay. Personal loans between individuals, sales of houses or fields, rental agreements for agricultural land. All these transactions, which form the fabric of everyday economic life for many, were increasingly committed to written witness tablets. A rather practical, quirky tidbit that illustrates the ubiquity of these records is the discovery of various dockets or labels. These were small pieces of clay, sometimes shaped like little tags, with a string hole, sometimes just rough lumps, that were inscribed with a brief summary of the contents of a particular basket, jar, or bundle of tablets. You might find one that says tablets concerning the field of Urbo, or accounts of silver for the Nana temple year 5. These were the ancient equivalents of file folder labels or a README ext file for an archive helping scribes navigate the sheer volume of information they were managing. This unseen bureaucracy, this relentless daily grind of impressing wedges onto clay, was what allowed Mesopotamian society to achieve such a high degree of organization and complexity. It was the mechanism for resource management, for labor mobilization, for legal certainty, and for economic exchange on a scale previously unimaginable. The records weren't just passive accounts of what had happened. They were active tools for planning, for decision-making, and for exercising authority. The empire, the temple, the merchant's venture, all rose on a foundation of meticulously kept clay. You've walked the dusty paths of ancient Mesopotamia, witnessed the birth of writing driven by the need for accounts, deciphered the logic of base 60 numbers, and felt the weight of clay tablets dense with the records of empires, temples, and everyday lives. You've seen how this meticulous system of bookkeeping, with its scribes, its seals, and its legal force, permeated every significant aspect of society for an astonishing 3,000 years. It was a remarkably durable and effective system. But as with all technologies, however revolutionary, the winds of change eventually begin to blow. The era of clay as the king of record-keeping would gradually fade, yet the fundamental ideas it nurtured would prove far more resilient, echoing down through the ages. For millennia, clay was the undisputed champion. It was cheap, readily available in the alluvial plains of the Tigris and Euphrates, and when inscribed with cuneiform and dried or baked, it was as incredibly durable. Its suitability for the wedge-based cuneiform script was perfect. This combination formed the bedrock of Mesopotamian administration, commerce, and law. But as civilizations evolved and interacted, new materials and new ways of writing began to emerge and offer compelling alternatives, especially as the geopolitical landscape of the Near East shifted. One such alternative was papyrus. Cultivated and processed primarily in Egypt, this remarkable plant yielded a smooth, light, and flexible writing surface. You could write on it with ink, using a reed pen or brush, allowing for faster, more fluid scripts than the laborious impressing of wedges into clay. Papyrus could be rolled into scrolls, making it far more portable than bulky collections of clay tablets. Imagine trying to send a strongly worded 20-page letter when each page is a heavy slab of clay. The postal workers, or rather the unfortunate messengers, must have been exceptionally well built, as the trade and cultural connections between Egypt and the Near East grew, and later as large empires like the Achaemenid Persians incorporated both regions, the use of papyrus spread. Then there was parchment and leather, made from treated animal skins. These materials were also durable, flexible, and excellent for writing on with ink. Parchment in particular offered a very fine surface and would become a favored medium in later antiquity and the medieval period. Like papyrus, these materials were much better suited to cursive alphabetic scripts than to the angular impressions of cuneiform. This brings us to another critical factor: the decline of cuneiform itself. For all its expressive power, cuneiform was an incredibly complex script. Mastering its hundreds of lines, its logographic and syllabic values, and its intricate rules took years of dedicated training in the Aduba. This inherently limited literacy to a relatively small scribal class. In contrast, alphabetic scripts, which began to develop and spread from the Levant in the 2nd millennium BCE, were far simpler. With only a couple of dozen characters representing basic sounds, alphabets were much easier to learn and use, potentially opening the door to wider literacy. A mainstream historical fact is that the Aramaic language, written with a relatively simple Semitic alphabet, began to gain prominence across the Near East. From the early first millennium it became a lingua franca, a common language of administration and trade, under the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires, and its importance exploded under the Achaemenid Persian Empire, which stretched from Egypt to India. For everyday administrative tasks, for correspondence, for many commercial records, Aramaic, written with ink on papyrus or parchment, gradually began to supplant Akkadian and Sumerian, written in cuneiform on clay. The old ways persisted, especially in traditional temple contexts, where scribes continued to copy religious texts, scholarly works, and astronomical observations in cuneiform. But its dominance in daily bookkeeping and administration waned. The last known datable cuneiform tablet is a rather poignant artifact, an astronomical almanac from 75 CE. This quirky tidbit highlights how long cuneiform managed to cling on in highly specialized scholarly niches, a testament to its deep historical roots and its suitability for certain types of complex data. But by this point in the Roman era, it was an ancient relic, its widespread practical use a distant memory. Someone somewhere was the very last person and who properly learned cuneiform for a living as their primary scribal skill. Bet their LinkedIn profile would have been truly unique. Proficient in Sumerian, Akkadian cuneiform script, sexagesimal mathematics, minor experience with Aramaic, seeks position references available upon request from the temple archives, mostly dust now. So, the clay tablets gradually faded from daily use, replaced by more convenient materials and simpler scripts. The bustling scriptoria, producing thousands of clay records, slowed and eventually fell silent. But what about all those foundational concepts of accounting and administration that had been developed and refined over 3 millennia of Mesopotamian practice? Did they disappear with the last wedge pressed into clay? Not at all. The firm ideas endured. Think about what the Mesopotamians achieved in their bookkeeping. The meticulous tracking of incomings and outgoings for goods and commodities, leading to a clear sense of surplus or deficit. While not full double-entry bookkeeping as developed later in medieval Italy, the underlying principles of balancing accounts and understanding assets versus liabilities were certainly there in nascent form. The absolute conviction that important economic transactions and agreements needed to be documented in writing, witnessed, and preserved. The use of ledgers, inventories, and categorized accounts to organize vast amounts of data. The concept of auditing and verification with checks and balances, like seals and witnesses, to ensure accuracy and accountability. The development of standardized formats and terminology for contracts, receipts, and other administrative documents to ensure clarity and legal consistency. These fundamental concepts of rational accounting and bureaucratic management didn't just vanish. The precise extent and direct pathways of influence from Mesopotamian accounting practices to later Greek and Roman systems, and subsequently to other cultures, are still debated by historians and archaeologists. Direct textual transmission of bookkeeping manuals, for example, is scarce. However, given the extensive trade and cultural interactions across the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, it's highly probable that these fundamental ideas about how to manage resources, record transactions, and ensure accountability were transmitted through commercial contact, administrative example, and the general diffusion of practical knowledge. Scholars continue to explore the subtle persistence of Mesopotamian scribal traditions and mathematical concepts in later periods, even after cuneiform itself ceased to be widely understood. So, while the physical clay tablets might have eventually been recycled by time or buried under new cities, the intellectual software they ran, the principles of systematic record-keeping, lived on in spirit anyway. The medium changed, the scripts evolved, but the human need for accountability and a reliable memory for economic life remained a constant, carrying forward the legacy of those first bookkeepers of ancient Mesopotamia. The reed styluses have long turned to dust. The great Mesopotamian cities have mostly crumbled back into the earth from which they were formed, and the cuneiform script itself is now the domain of dedicated scholars, a silent language on weathered clay. The physical medium of the clay tablet, once the cutting edge of information technology, has been superseded many times over by papyrus, parchment paper, and now the ethereal realm of digital data. Yet, as you drift in this space between wakefulness and sleep, you might just feel the surprisingly long shadow cast by those ancient bookkeepers. Their world of meticulous records, though vastly different from our own, laid down conceptual trackbeds that our modern information age still in some ways follows. The core human needs that drove the Dubsar to press those wedges into clay are remarkably similar to the needs that drive us today. The necessity for accountability, for knowing who owes what to whom, for tracking the resources that sustain us, whether it's bushels of barley in ancient Uruk or billions of bytes on a global server, remains a fundamental constant of organized society. Their work was at its heart about data management. They gathered data, categorized it, stored it, and retrieved it to inform decisions. We do precisely the same, though our tools are infinitely more powerful and the scale unimaginably vaster. Imagine the cooling system needed for an archive of a few million heavy clay tablets. Probably just a very, very big fan, a lot of desert air, and an optimistic prayer to Enlil for no flash floods. Consider the standardization they developed. Those formulaic contracts, the consistent ways of listing goods and quantities. These were early attempts to create clarity and reduce ambiguity, much like our modern accounting standards or legal templates strive to do. The concept of verification and audit, embodied in their use of witnesses, cylinder seals, and case tablets, speaks to an enduring understanding that records must be trustworthy. While they might not have had forensic accountants in quite the same way, the temple or palace overseer checking the grain receipts against the granary stocks was performing a rudimentary but vital form of audit. And then there are the more direct, tangible legacies. Every time you glance at a clock and see the hour divided into 60 minutes, and each minute into 60 seconds, you are living within a system directly inherited from Mesopotamian sexagesimal mathematics. This is a mainstream historical fact. Similarly, the 360 degrees that make up a circle, a concept fundamental to geometry, navigation, and astronomy, also has its roots in their base 60 thinking. These ancient ways of measuring and dividing the world are so deeply embedded in our own systems that we rarely pause to consider their Mesopotamian origins. The very idea of a legally binding written contract, witnessed and validated, which forms the bedrock of so much of our modern legal and commercial interaction, owes a significant debt to those early clay tablets where such agreements were first formalized. And our vast archives, whether of physical libraries or digital database, are merely the contemporary expression of that ancient impulse to preserve important information for future reference, just as the Mesopotamians carefully stored their tablets in temple and palace strong rooms. The journey from clay to the cloud has been a long and winding one. The tools have changed beyond all recognition. Your ancient counterpart, the dubser, meticulously pressed a reed stylus into damp earth, while a modern accountant taps on a keyboard, their calculation flashing across a screen in milliseconds. Yet, the fundamental job, the intellectual task of bringing order to complex economic data, shares a common ancestry. Same fundamental job, just considerably fewer chances of dropping your annual ledger on your foot and breaking a toe unless your laptop is made of lead. The quirky tidbit here is that some of those ancient cuneiform mathematical tablets weren't just simple arithmetic. They contain problems that are essentially algebraic or geometrical in nature, showing a capacity for abstract mathematical thought that went far beyond just counting sheep or barley. They grappled with concepts like square roots, cubic equations, and calculating the areas of complex shapes, all of which indirectly supported the sophisticated accounting needed for tasks like land surveying, architectural planning, or even calculating compound interest on long-term loans. They were, in their own way, pushing the boundaries of applied mathematics to meet the demands of their increasingly complex society. The degree to which early Mesopotamian economic thought is reflected in their accounting practices contained nascent concepts of value, profit, or capital in a manner comparable to later economic theories, is a subject of ongoing scholarly interpretation and discussion. It seems that bureaucracy and the attendant need for meticulous records might just be one of the oldest human inventions, perhaps right up there with the wheel, and as the Mesopotamians would surely agree, beer. That fundamental human desire to record, to remember, to create order out of the potential chaos of human interaction, and to hold each other to account, is a thread that connects our brightly lit digital world to the dim, dusty archives of the first cities. The cuneiform signs have faded from common use, but the echoes of the systems they represented, the very idea of organized, reliable bookkeeping, continue to resonate, a quiet testament to the enduring ingenuity of those ancient masters of clay. And so, as the story of Mesopotamian bookkeeping gently draws to a close, you can feel the soft weight of those millennia settling around you. The meticulous scratching of the stylus on clay fades into a distant murmur like the wind whispering through ancient reeds. The bustling cities, the grand temples, the diligent scribes all begin to soften at the edges, their once sharp realities now imbued with the gentle haze of deep time. Let the sheer unwavering persistence of their efforts, the quiet dedication of countless individuals over countless generations simply to keep track, to make sense of their world, be a soothing thought. There's a profound continuity in the human endeavor to organize and understand, a thread that stretches from those first clay tablets to the silent hum of the device you might be listening on. The challenges change, the tools evolve, but that fundamental drive for order remains. Allow that sense of enduring connection to cradle you as you drift further, letting the details dissolve, leaving only a peaceful awareness of the long, slow unfolding of human ingenuity. The need for lists and ledgers, for receipts and records, is now a gentle, rhythmic pulse fading into the quiet of the night.